Welcome to the Winter Annual Forage Crop Tour, featuring plots from Michigan State University and speakers from KWS Cereals and TriCal. I'm Peyton Walker, a student at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and I will serve as the moderator for this virtual crop tour. Today we are joined by Klaus Nymund, the product manager for KWS Cereals. Klaus is based in Colorado, but originally is from Denmark. Welcome, Klaus.
Thank you.
Also joining us is Ted Rogers from TriCal. Ted has been a certified crop advisor for over 20 years and is an MSU alum. Welcome, Ted.
Hello.
Ted, let's start off with a general question. Why should farmers consider double cropping a winter annual forage crop?
So we get this question actually quite a bit, and I know you didn't expect that slide as my first slide, but it gets people thinking. You know, you wouldn't give your hired man the whole winter off, right? That wouldn't be a good use of that resource. And likewise, you know, why would you let your land lay idle or bare all winter long? I think there's better options. We can do more with that idle land. This is a pretty typical scene that we see in Michigan. We think around 50% of the acres have bare dirt on them that could be double cropped with a winter annual forage. And, you know, there's lots of good reasons why we can improve upon that situation. One is just simply more productivity to get more tonnage and an actual forage crop off what otherwise would be just idle soil. Another one is manure management. As there's more and more regulation around NP and K, we need to have a balanced approach. And so obviously if we can grow a forage crop and remove that NP and K, we're going to be able to apply more manure and utilize another application on a green and growing crop. And the final one, you know, typically in Michigan, we have pretty wet springs, and we have the ability using the annual winter forage crop to actually pull the trigger on harvesting that in the spring. And if it's a really wet winter, we're actually going to be able to dry that soil out more quickly if we have something green and growing on it versus just bare soil. So instead of that bare soil picture that you just saw, here's an example of what you could have. This picture was taken April 28th, 2021 in Hopkins, Michigan. This farm is Mike Timmer's farm. And this forage crop is ready to harvest. It's right at flag leaf stage. And we had a little bit warmer spring than usual. Typically, we would expect it to look like this in early May. And obviously, this picture was taken in late April. Often I get questions around, what are some of the numbers? What could I expect for tonnage? And the other question I get is, well, is it going to screw up my corn planting? And so if you've never used a winter annual forage crop, those are really good questions, things I think that are on most farmers' minds. And so kind of two parts to that. One, we frequently see 2 to 4 dry matter tons per acre for yield, but the environment matters a lot and the timing of harvest matters a lot. And then in regards to the question around, is it going to screw up my corn planting window? It doesn't have to. You could pull the trigger on harvesting that forage crop anytime you want in the spring, and you're going to have a super high quality crop. If you harvest it on the early side, the tonnage may be smaller, but the quality will still be there. So what we find is that when people first start to get into annual forage crops, at first they pull the trigger when they normally would want to plant corn. So just when you want to go plant corn 2 or 3 days before that, get out there, swath it, and let it wilt down, use a pickup header on the chopper, and put it in the silage bunk. Then get your manure on for your corn, and then come in and plant your corn. But over time, what we've discovered is that if we look at it as a holistic systems approach, and you want to maximize the whole productivity on the acre, growers tend to slightly reduce the maturity on their corn silage enough to let that winter annual forage crop run another 5 or 6 days, and they really see a nice bump in tonnage. And on the screen, you'll see some data out of New York State, which has, in general, a shorter growing season than Michigan, but it's somewhat directionally correct. So you can kind of see what you've given up if you delay your corn planting a little bit and plant a shorter maturity, and then let your triticale or hybrid rye run a little bit longer.
All right, thank you, Ted. Klaus, after a grower decides to plant hybrid rye or triticale, do you have any planting tips for them to consider?
KWS Pro hybrid rye for forage. Our hybrid rye units for forage is sold in 800,000 live seeds per bag. And the weight for the 800,000 live seeds will always be given on the bags. Remark that it can vary from seed lot to seed lot because when it's live seeds, of course, we take into account the germination and the seed weight. So our recommendation for seeding per acre is 800,000 seeds. And this is what we normally see when we can get it seeded in mid-September. If we can get it in earlier in September, we can go down in seeding rate. And it's important to go down in seeding rate because the hybrid's ability to tiller, it's much higher than we have seen from the old conventional rye. So therefore, we really have to utilize this hybrid vigor and not get it too dense. If we get it too dense and it gets too much fertilizer, then we can see some lodging coming on in spring. So please follow these recommendations. If we get up to the 1st of October or later, it really depends on the conditions of the soil. Is it good seeding bed? Do we have a high temperature still in the soil? If we want to stay with 800,000 seed per acre, or if we have to increase a little bit. But speak to your local advisor about that, or contact either us or Tricale. Seeding depth is also very important to remark that we would not like it seeded deeper than 0.8 inch. And this is due to the smaller grain from rye than we have from the other cereals. Of course, if it's really, really dry soil, we can go a little bit further down to get some moisture in the soil. But otherwise, our recommendation is 0.8 inch seeding depth. And be precise about that because we are dealing with low seeding rates, so we should really try to be precise and get all the seeds germinating, so we don't get too many holes in the planting density.
Klaus, just to chime in on the triticale recommendations for seeding. For triticale, we recommend 100 pounds per acre and 1 1/4 inch on the depth. And I think for the Michigan marketplace, we've seen a lot of luck with growers planting in September, but really in most cases, it's really as soon as the silage corn gets cut and removed from the field, which typically is around that September 1 timeframe, September 15. That's a really great time to get your hybrid, rye planted or your triticale planted.
Yes, correct. But still, I think the difference in the seeding rates is quite important. Weed control. Hybrid rye has really, really strong competition to wheat normally, and it's due to the exudates, which is the roots are delivering into the soil, and which many wheat seeds do not like and do not germinate when these exudates is available in the soils. And the hybrid has a wider and deeper root system as the old population rye, and this way it also has a better competition towards the wheat. And in this example, you can see wheat and hybrid rye seeded at the same time in the same field, and you can really see the difference, both the vigorous growth from the hybrid rye in comparison to the wheat, but you can also see the effect of the root exudates really depress the wheat's growth. Of course, there is some wheat which typically come and grow fast in the autumn, like chickweed and red dead nettle. These two can be quite vulnerable, and therefore, if they are present, which they can be, we always recommend these to be treated in the autumn. This because they can be very hard to the autumn development of the cereals, but also because they are much easier to treat and control in the autumn. and quite often it can be controlled in the autumn as soon as they germinate with a very low dose of a herbicide, and this way make it also economically more acceptable. So please have a look at your stand in early October or mid-October and really evaluate if you should treat it. In terms of chemicals, it depends on the temperature and so on, but there is several chemicals available for treatment or for controlling these weeds. Then fertilization, it's very important, and I think it's the same for the triticale, that we have some support of nitrogen in the autumn. It can be given through manure, and of course, as Ted also introduced, that we can get a much better manure management by having this winter forage. And if we get the manure out in early September, mid-September, it's not always we need to apply extra nitrogen, especially if we have a really fertile soil. It's maybe not needed. I would say manure in the autumn, even liquid, it's not released straight away. So sometimes if we get closer to the 1st of October, it will be a preference also to add maybe 20 to 30 pounds of nitrogen as artificial fertilizer, and then really take the benefit of the manure in the early spring, what was applied in the autumn. The fertilization in spring has to be done extremely early as possible. I normally say if you can get out on the late morning frost, just a regrowth, that's why when the final fertilization has to take place. It can be done by liquid manure if it can be added with kind of boom with pipes on. So it's not the best thing to spread it on top of the crop, but if it can be added by these pipes or tubes, this will also be okay, and the hybrid rye can really utilize it in the early spring. Otherwise, the total in terms of getting a good quality, it should be around 100 to 120 pounds of nitrogen, depending, of course, if you want to take it on early flag leaf or if you want to leave it for milky stage. The more you want, or the longer you want to leave it, the higher you have to go in terms of in application. Then also, it takes away about 20 pounds of phosphorus, about 40 pounds of potassium, and then sulfur is more and more a needed nutrient. So don't forget about the sulfur. And sulfur is best added in the spring. That's where you get the benefit of it. If you add it in the autumn, it can be leached before the plant really get the benefit. So this is important. If there is a lot of sandy soil and dry conditions in the autumn, I quite often recommend to add 4 pounds of manganese sulfate, really to get a good root development and also increase the sugar content in the plant to overcome the winter. So this is the fertilization. I think Ted, it's what do you have any other things for triticale?
Thank you, Klaus, for those great ideas. Now let's chat about the specific plot at Michigan State University. What are we trying to learn here?
So we've been doing plots with Michigan State University. I think this is our 3rd season with Dr. Kim Cassida and technician Joe Paling. And basically, there's a few things we're trying to learn, the most important of which is local adaptation for Michigan. So we want to know which varieties best are situated and best adapted for the local Michigan environment. So we want to have something with good winter hardiness, the correct maturity, good tonnage, resistance to lodging, and lastly, good forage quality. So good ADF, NDF, milk per acre, and protein. So here's a picture of the plots that are out there. And what we have is this year we had 15 different varieties planted, and each of those have been replicated, I think 3 times. And each plot is 5 foot wide by, I believe, 8 foot wide. And so it gives us a really good chance to see the varieties. And over the last 3 years, we've been actually able to see them in a variety of different environmental conditions too, which is really helpful. This past year, these went in the ground at a really good time of year, and we had favorable growing conditions both in the fall and this spring. And so we had some really early development. These pictures, I believe they were taken April 28th. And here's just an example of a key learning here. We've got Wheeler rye, which is a conventional cereal rye on the left, lodged and laying down. And then we've got some Flex 719 triticale right beside it. So they only go back to this point here, if you can see my cursor. But this is the sort of stuff we want to learn in a plot setting instead of on someone's farm. So that's the reason we do the research there. 3 of the varieties that we think performed the best there really fit well to spread out maturity for your harvest timing too. So these winter annual forage crops, they move through the maturities very, very quickly in the spring. And if you get a significant amount of acres planted of these, it really makes a lot of sense to plant a portfolio of different varieties to spread out your harvest timing. In most cases, most farmers don't have enough equipment to cut fast enough to keep up with a maturing crop. So if you wanted to put together a combination of kind of an early, a little bit later, and a significantly later product, you could plant the KWS Pro Power Hybrid Rye first. You can see that's farthest along in its development. Gainer 154 triticale was about 3 days later than that. And then 5 days later than the Gainer, the Flex is a later maturing product. And that would allow the growers to get across each one before they get too far along in their development. So what are the breeders working on? What are they trying to improve in the crop? Better standability. That's always a hot button with growers. They want to make sure the product's going to stand for harvest. They want to have a winter hardy product that won't get killed off in a tough winter. They want products that'll break dormancy quickly, and they want reduced awns. This photo here on the right shows a fully awned variety. This would be Gainer, I think, is the variety on this one. This middle one is an unleaded variety. So Flex is an unleaded variety. And then the one on the left is Surge, which is a truly awnless variety. This matters more to the folks that are going to be grazing it or taking it for hay. If you're going to be chopping it, the awns really don't matter. The chopper chops it up, and by the time it gets inside, they get softened. This shows just a little bit of the development of roots on some of the newer varieties versus some of the older ones. The ones that are blue are some of the newer varieties of triticale, and the red ones are some of the older varieties. And then over here on the far left, this is wheat, which you can see is it just doesn't have the same vigor. So those were a couple of things we were trying to learn specifically at the MSU plot.
Thank you, Ted. Those photos are really interesting. So again, that plot was planted September 27th, and those photos were taken on April 28th. Now, Klaus, what are the advantages to hybrid rye over conventional rye?
Ted just explained a little bit about what are the breeders actually looking for, and what are the breeders in hybrid rye looking for, and what are the benefits of the hybrid rye. The rye is really known for having a really, really high winter hardiness, and so do the hybrids. And this is one of our first selection. It's to really have a really, really good winter hardiness. And especially because the rye will be seeded in many different times in the autumn, and this way having many different developments before the winter. So winter hardiness is really something which is extraordinary good in the hybrids. Also, what is good in the hybrid is the drought tolerance, and this is due to the extreme deep and wide root development, as also shown on the picture on the right here. So even on all kinds of soils, the root really goes deep and go wide. And quite often we see this difference when we have really dry conditions, when we get later in the spring, where really this root development helps the hybrid rye to get through a really dry situation. Then, of course, all the forage varieties we are having, we select them for earliness, and this due to we see this as a need for the double cropping system. Of course, it depends on which kind of second crop you want to grow and which region you are in, because there is many different second crops which can be grown if the environment is for it. But in this case of Michigan, of course, we have been looking at the different hybrids, and also as Ted said, earliness is important because we don't want to take time away from the corn seeding. So in this picture, you can see on your right hand side here, you can see the normal wheat development in the region in comparison to hybrid rye at the same time in early spring, where you really can see the difference in the vigor from the hybrid rye. So yeah, KWS ProPower is really early and also a little bit earlier than the main triticale gainer for the region. So when do cutting takes place, I think it's very important that if you want to have a really high quality with especially a high protein to feed alongside with your corn silage, it's really the time of flat leaf you have to consider to windrow it. To let it wither and dry out a little bit before you chop it. Growing is really fast, and I think it's more or less the same for both triticale and for rye, that the development from flat leaf to early bud is really going over maybe 2 or 3 days. So when the flat leaf is out, that's where you have to consider to get all your machinery and all your planning set up for chopping it. And if the bud or if the head is coming out, it doesn't matter. You won't lower the quality too much, but if you leave it too long with the head out, that's really where the protein starts to go down. But at the same time, you also really increase the biomass when the head is coming out. So this is on the early cutting, and there you normally get up to about 20% of protein in your silage of the dry matter. Then the milking stage, it's really if you have another second crop you want to put in, or if you want to produce a very high biomass and use it for your dry cows or your heifers, then of course you can go for milking stage. And when I say milking stage, it's very important that you can decide between the milking stage and early dough. For triticale and for barley and winter wheat, you normally say early dough. But for rye, it's very important not to go to early dough, but take it at milking stage. That's where you have the highest biomass. And I've tried to show the pictures how it looks at the milking stage. It's still green. You have a really nice green plant. And if you look at early dough stage, for rye and hybrid rye at early dough, all the leaves are already starting to wilt, to burn down, and there you will always lose a lot of biomass, but not only biomass, you will also lose a lot of good quality. So it has to be taken a little bit earlier, but again, here, if you have both triticale and hybrid rye, you really have a good room in between the two for cutting. So you get it all taken at the right stage. Just Ted mentioned about New York State, Cornell. Here's just, we have a lot of questions. Do it really yield more than the old VNS rye or the old conventional rye types? And here you see from Cornell 2020, if you take it on the early stage, it was in mid-May here. It's a little bit later over by Cornell. And then again at the 16th of June. And there you clearly see the preference and the high yield potential by the hybrids, even from the small plots here. So I think there is a benefit, and there is a good reason to take the hybrid in comparison to the old population, and also really the standability you get along with the hybrid is really important.
Thank you, Klaus, for those harvesting tips. Ted, do you have anything you would like to add?
Just to add in and give you a little bit of some more color around the harvest tips. There's a lot of flexibility that growers have when it comes time to harvest. And there's a few different management decisions you need to make. The first decision really is around, what am I going to do with this feed? Am I trying to feed lactating cows, or am I trying to feed dry cows or heifers? So depending on that timing, you really can pull the trigger on harvesting that and slide that up or back maybe a week or two. The other thing to consider is, is it a wet spring? Michigan has traditionally pretty wet springs, and frequently the biggest obstacle to getting your corn planted on time is it's just too wet to get the equipment across the field. And you can use a winter annual forage crop to actually dry out the soils in those situations. Or conversely, if it's dry, you could pull the trigger on harvest early and preserve that moisture for your corn crop if needed. So here's a picture of a typical, this looks like a typical corn planting situation. I think that's up in the thumb where someone had buried their tractor. It was just too wet to plant. And I'm sure nobody's ever done that before, but always optimistic. It looks like he never gave up, just kept going deeper and deeper. So alternatively, you could have something like this, a nice fibrous root system to drive across after harvest. That plant is actually going to act like a pump and continue to pump out the water and dry up the soil. We've put metrics to that. Some data that was done at Cornell showed that it was 60% drier, 60% less moisture with triticale compared to bare soil. So it's a management tool that you can use to actually get your corn planted quicker than you could with bare soil. So on that previous slide, I talked a little bit about harvest timing for the different usage type. So if you're going for lactating cows, the right time to get out in the field and harvest it is stage 9, which is when the flag leaf is out. And that's before the head has emerged. So if you see the head emerge, you're a little bit on the late side. So what happens throughout that process? Basically, tonnage increases dramatically, 35% over this time frame, but at the same time, quality does decrease. So if you get to the point where it's soft dough or milky stage, you've got good dry cow feed or good heifer feed. If you're going for lactating cows, you need to pull the trigger earlier at this stage 9 or flag leaf stage. And it goes through there so quickly that if you're not scouting every 3 days or so, there's a really good chance you're going to miss it. So you really need to scout aggressively and keep an eye on it. And if you see the head start to emerge, you need to go get the equipment out and swath it. This is the typical scenario here where we'd recommend you swath it. Set the swather as wide as possible. There's typically a lot of material there. You want to lay that out and let it dry or wilt, and then use the pickup header to chop it and put it in the silage bunker. Also wanted to give credit to Tom Kilser with Advanced Agri-Systems. Tom does a lot of very basic research and really very original ideas. And so Tom's a good guy to get signed up on his newsletter and really get some good information from. Here's one of the ideas that Tom has been working on. The basic concept is, what time of day should I swath this annual forage crop? Should I swath it in the evening, in the midday, in the morning? What he's found is the optimal time to swath it is around 10 a.m. in the morning. So after the dew is off, but with as many hours of daylight as remaining as possible. And the concept, similar to fresh cut flowers, that plant, even though you've cut it off, it isn't actually dead quite yet. It continues to have photosynthesis. And chemically, what's going on with the plant when it has photosynthesis, even after it's cut, if it can see sunlight, it's going to continue to take CO2 and sunlight and make oxygen and sugar. And so we can continue to drive the sugar content up in the crop, depending on the time of day with which we harvest it. So ideally it's mid-morning, but also, you've got workload to consider, and it may not be possible to, always harvest at the exact time. But I think it is an interesting concept to at least consider, and if possible, execute on. One other interesting thing that we've heard from multiple dairy farmers is that they've experienced better milk numbers and reduced stress on their cows in the middle of the hottest days in summer if they're feeding either rye or triticale. And we haven't done a lot of research on this, but anecdotally we've heard it from enough people that we think it's true, that it may be worth an area for MSU to research, or maybe Tom will spend some time on this, but just something to think about. There must be something that's happening in the digestion with a cow that's allowing them to make more milk during those hottest summer months versus corn silage. Lastly, wanted to just talk about, we've brought the crop through from planting, fertilizer, we're in late April, mid-May, what's the next step? And really the next step is, this is an opportunity to get another manure application in the ground before you go ahead and plant corn silage or forage sorghum. Forage sorghum is another great option that I think a lot of people are overlooking that you could consider. And we've seen a lot of good luck with these. I think they're called bazookas. They're liquid manure, injectable with a fluted coulter, and basically just injecting that liquid manure and sealing it back up. It also helps reduce runoff. So there's some good environmental impact there as well. So that's what I had as far as harvest tips go.
Thank you, Ted, and thank you, Klaus, as well, for some great information. Now, where can farmers get more information if they so need?
So our website is tricalforage.com. Klaus, what's a good website for you guys if people want more information?
That's the www.kwsus.us.com.
I also think we've got information on YouTube videos as well, so you might check out the YouTube links or subscribe for more information. Our intention is to break this down into different short segments. So if you want a reference material, come back and say, hey, I just want to watch the 2-minute segment on planting tips. You'll be able to find that on YouTube. If you just want to see the segment on harvest tips, you'll be able to see that on YouTube. So thanks, Peyton, for moderating that today. And thanks to Michigan State as well for doing all the good research they do in East Lansing. And it was good to come back and actually be on site and see all the good research that Dr. Cassett is doing with Joe Paling.
I would also like to thank you very much for being a part of this. And just to all the farmers out there, I think it's very important that you think about ordering seeds as soon as possible, because it seems there could be a lack of seeds for the coming season. So that's just a good recommendation.
Yep. Good reminder. Yep.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us.